Aarushi Sharma's wedding was supposed to be her fairytale beginning. Instead, it became the night her bloodline's darkest secret was revealed. Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansoor, her wealthy husband from Dubai, discovered a horrifying truth on their wedding night. The young Indian bride he had just married was his own granddaughter. Aarushi Sharma had grown up in a modest home on the edge of Jodhpur, where every sunrise brought the same struggle: bills, borrowed money, and the quiet despair of an uncertain future. Her father, a retired schoolteacher, and her mother, a seamstress, spent their lives making ends meet. Yet, amid the dusty streets and faded walls, Aarushi's beauty stood out like a miracle. She was the kind of woman people whispered about: graceful, calm, and with eyes that carried both innocence and mystery. She had dreams, of course, but they were small and fragile, shaped by the limits of her world. Everything changed the day Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansoor arrived in town. A man of power and wealth, he had traveled from Dubai to India under the guise of supporting an education charity. His convoy of black cars, foreign bodyguards, and shimmering gold accessories drew attention everywhere he went. At a cultural function arranged by the local community, Aarushi had been chosen to welcome him with a garland and traditional dance. The moment she approached him, something in her quiet presence caught his attention. She seemed untouched by the material world he was drowning in, and that purity awakened something strange in him, a mix of fascination and obsession. Within days, his aides visited Aarushi's home with gifts: silk saris, perfumes, and gold bangles that shimmered under the dim light of the small living room. Her parents were overwhelmed, both flattered and frightened. They were told that Sheikh Rashid had taken a liking to their daughter and wished to marry her. No one dared to question how a man of such immense status could fall for a simple Indian girl, but poverty silenced their doubts. Rashid promised to take care of the entire family, clear their debts, and ensure Aarushi lived like royalty. Her father hesitated at first, troubled by the vast age difference, but the thought of a secure life for his daughter outweighed his unease. Aarushi herself was unsure. She didn't understand why this stranger, old enough to be her grandfather, wanted her as his bride. But as the preparations began, she was swept into a whirlwind of luxury she had never imagined. Tailors, jewelers, and makeup artists filled their home. Foreign designers sent gowns and accessories. Reporters arrived, photographing the magical cross-border love story. Overnight, Aarushi became a symbol of hope, a local girl chosen by destiny. Yet behind her forced smiles, she felt an unease she couldn't name. Rashid visited often in those days, always polite, always distant. He never spoke of his past, never laughed, and carried a heaviness that followed him like a shadow. He treated Aarushi with a cold kind of respect, as though she was a treasure he needed to possess rather than love. Still, her family saw only fortune and honor. They believed they had found their salvation in him. As the wedding date approached, Aarushi's small world transformed into a spectacle of wealth. The humble lanes she once walked barefoot were now crowded with photographers and caterers. But in quiet moments, she found herself staring at Rashid, wondering who he really was. His eyes sometimes lingered on her, not with affection, but with something darker, as if she reminded him of someone he once knew, someone buried deep in memory. What none of them realized was that this glittering proposal was not a gift from fate. It was the beginning of a tragedy written long ago, a story of love, sin, and bloodlines that would soon destroy them all. The wedding of Aarushi Sharma and Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansoor became the most talked-about event in Jodhpur's history. It was as if the desert itself had been draped in gold. The palace chosen for the ceremony once belonged to a forgotten royal family and was now transformed into a spectacle of wealth and extravagance. Chandeliers glowed like captured stars, and musicians played tunes from both India and Arabia. The air carried the scent of roses, jasmine, and sandalwood, mingling with the whispers of curious guests who could not stop talking about the strange union between a young Indian girl and an aging Arab tycoon. Aarushi sat in a dressing room surrounded by women who worked endlessly to perfect her look. Her red bridal lehenga shimmered with gold embroidery, heavy enough to weigh down her steps. Her face was painted flawlessly, her jewelry glittering under every light. Yet her eyes remained distant. She felt like a guest in her own life, watching everything unfold from behind an invisible curtain. Her mother kept assuring her that this was destiny's blessing, a chance to escape the life of scarcity and struggle. But as Aarushi looked at her reflection, she saw not a bride, but a stranger trapped in a dream too grand to be real. Outside, Sheikh Rashid made his entrance with royal precision. He arrived in a convoy of black vehicles, followed by guards carrying gifts wrapped in silk. He walked slowly, wearing an ivory robe lined with gold thread and a diamond-studded watch that sparkled under the sun. His presence commanded silence, not warmth. People bowed respectfully as he passed, some out of admiration, others out of unease. When he finally stood beside Aarushi during the ceremony, the age gap became painfully visible. Yet the photographers captured it as a moment of grace, the young bride beside her powerful husband. The rituals continued into the night, blending tradition with opulence. Every corner of the palace overflowed with luxury fountains filled with rose petals, tables stacked with exotic dishes, and musicians flown in from Dubai. The guests toasted the unlikely couple, unaware of the unease that lingered in Rashid's eyes. During the reception, one of his close aides approached him quietly, handing over a brown folder. Rashid opened it with disinterest at first, flipping through documents that appeared to be standard legal papers for Aarushi's travel visa. But then his expression stiffened. His hand trembled slightly as he stared at one name printed on the page, *Meher Fatima. It was a name he had not seen in over 40 years. The noise of the party faded in his mind as old memories surfaced: a young Indian woman, her laughter, her tears, and the child he never met. He excused himself, retreating to a quiet corner of the palace where he read through every page. The details lined up too perfectly: the age, the birthplace, the family background. His heart pounded with disbelief, and for the first time that night he looked at Aarushi not as his bride, but as a reflection of the past he had buried. As the celebration continued, Rashid returned to the crowd with a forced smile. No one noticed the tension in his shoulders or the darkness that had settled in his gaze. He danced when he was expected to, raised his glass during toasts, and accepted congratulations from people who had no idea that his world had just shattered. To the guests, it was a perfect wedding. To Rashid, it had become the beginning of an unbearable nightmare. When the night drew to a close, the guests began to leave, still marveling at the grandeur. Aarushi's parents wept tears of joy, believing their daughter had entered a life of safety and abundance. But somewhere behind the palace walls, Rashid's calm demeanor had turned into silent chaos. He had uncovered a truth too horrifying to ignore, and the secret he carried would soon destroy everything the world had celebrated that day. When the last of the wedding guests departed and the palace fell silent, the night grew heavy with an unnatural stillness. The grand suite prepared for the newlyweds was filled with the faint scent of roses, candles flickering against the marble walls, and gold decorations that gleamed under dim light. To anyone outside, it looked like a room made for romance, but inside it was becoming a chamber of dread. Aarushi sat nervously on the edge of the bed, her bridal jewelry still clinking softly with every movement. She could hear the faint sounds of guards outside the door and the distant hum of generators keeping the palace lit. She didn't know that behind her, the man she had just married was drowning in memories too dark to share. Rashid stood near the window, staring into the darkness beyond the palace courtyard. His mind was no longer in the present. The documents he had seen that evening replayed in his head like a nightmare he couldn't escape. The name *Meher Fatima* echoed again and again, taking him back to a time when he was a young man visiting India for business. He had met Meher in her early 20s, a woman full of life and hope, someone who believed his promises of love and marriage. He had left her behind when he returned to Dubai, never contacting her again. He told himself it was for the best. She was poor, he was ambitious, and the worlds they came from could never meet. But as the years passed, the memory of Meher lingered, and guilt occasionally pricked his conscience like a dull knife he refused to face. Now, decades later, the truth clawed its way back to him in the cruelest form possible. The documents revealed that Aarushi's mother was indeed Meher Fatima. There were dates, signatures, and family connections that left no room for doubt. Aarushi was Meher's only child, which meant she was Rashid's granddaughter. He had unknowingly married his own blood. The revelation broke him in a way he couldn't explain. Every smile from Aarushi, every glance, every touch from the ceremony now felt like poison running through his veins. He couldn't tell her, couldn't face what he had done. His mind filled with disgust, shame, and disbelief. The silence in the suite grew unbearable. Rashid began pacing the floor, his breathing unsteady. Aarushi, still unaware of the truth, asked him if he was all right, but he didn't respond. He turned toward her, his expression twisted with rage and confusion. In that moment, it was as if something inside him snapped. Years of guilt, denial, and buried sin erupted all at once. The room filled with the sound of breaking glass, a crash of furniture, and a scream that was quickly silenced. By midnight, the candles had burned low. The guards stationed outside thought they heard something, but dismissed it as an argument between newlyweds. No one dared to disturb the sheikh. Hours passed, and the palace corridors returned to their eerie quiet. Behind the locked door, tragedy had already taken its final form. The golden decorations, the flowers, and the luxury that had dazzled the world now surrounded a scene too horrifying to imagine. The man who once believed he could buy anything, love, power, forgiveness, had discovered the one truth money could never bury. The past never dies. It waits in silence, hidden beneath years of wealth and pride, until it rises again to demand its price. That night, Rashid paid it in blood. The morning after the wedding was eerily quiet. The palace, which had been bursting with music and laughter only hours before, now stood in stillness. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, falling on the marble floors where petals from the previous night's celebration still lay scattered. The staff moved about slowly, cleaning up after the festivities, unaware of the horror that waited behind the door of the bridal suite. The guards outside the room had noticed that no one had come out since midnight, but they assumed the couple wanted privacy after the long day. It wasn't until late morning, when breakfast remained untouched and calls went unanswered, that a faint sense of worry began to spread through the corridors. When the palace manager finally approached the door, he hesitated before knocking. There was no response. He called out softly, but silence answered him. After a few moments of hesitation, he ordered one of the guards to unlock the door. The hinges creaked open, releasing a wave of stale air mixed with the metallic scent of blood. Inside, the room looked like a broken dream. The silk curtains were torn, a vase lay shattered across the floor, and the bed was disheveled as though a storm had passed through it. On the floor near the dresser lay Aarushi, still dressed in her wedding attire, her jewelry tangled in her hair, her face bruised and lifeless. The bright red of her bridal dress had mixed with a darker shade that no one could mistake for anything but blood. Rashid sat a few feet away, motionless on the couch, his eyes fixed on nothing. He was still wearing his white robe, now stained crimson around the cuffs. He didn't speak, didn't look at anyone, didn't even react when the guards rushed in. The staff froze in shock, too afraid to approach him. The scene didn't feel real. It was as if the grandeur of the night before had dissolved into a night where no one could wake from. When the local authorities arrived, Rashid did not resist arrest. He stood up silently, allowed the handcuffs to be placed on his wrists, and walked out of the palace without saying a single word. News of the tragedy spread like wildfire. Within hours, reporters surrounded the palace gates, shouting questions, taking photographs, and speculating wildly about what could have happened. Some said it was an act of jealousy. Others whispered about betrayal or black magic. The headlines painted Rashid as a monster, a wealthy man who had murdered his young bride in a fit of rage. Aarushi's family, who had gone home after the wedding, were called back and fainted upon seeing her body. Her mother screamed until her voice gave out, unable to understand how her daughter's dream had turned into a coffin overnight. The autopsy confirmed that Rashid had died from multiple blunt force injuries. There was no sign of an external attack. Everything pointed to domestic violence. Yet, when questioned, Rashid remained calm and expressionless. He neither denied nor confessed. His silence unnerved everyone. Behind that silence, however, was a storm of guilt and horror that he could not share. To the investigators, it appeared as though the murder had been driven by rage, but the truth was far more disturbing, a truth that would only come to light when the past was finally uncovered. The palace, once a symbol of celebration, became a haunted memory overnight. The room where Aarushi had died was sealed off by the police, the floor still marked with the outline of her body. Every trace of the wedding, the garlands, the candles, the gold decorations was removed, but the tragedy lingered like a curse. In less than 24 hours, a love story that had been celebrated by thousands had transformed into one of the darkest scandals the city had ever witnessed. The days that followed the murder were filled with chaos, sorrow, and confusion. The palace was surrounded by police vans, journalists, and crowds of people who could not believe what had happened. Aarushi's death had turned from a private tragedy into a public scandal that crossed borders. Newspapers in both India and the Middle East printed her picture on their front pages, a young bride with gentle eyes, dressed in red, frozen forever in time. The story of the poor Indian girl who married a rich sheikh and died on her wedding night shocked the world, but the truth was still hidden behind Rashid's silence. When the investigation began, Rashid refused to cooperate. He sat through every interrogation without emotion, answering only when necessary. His lawyers tried to use his age, his wealth, and his supposed mental instability as defense, but the detectives were determined to find out what had really happened. They traced Aarushi's background, reviewed her family documents, and contacted everyone connected to her past. That was when the name *Meher Fatima surfaced. At first, it seemed like a minor detail, the name of Aarushi's late mother on an old record, but when one of the officers looked into her history, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Meher Fatima had once been listed as an acquaintance of Rashid Al-Mansoor in Dubai decades earlier. The police sent a team to Rajasthan to find out more. They eventually located Meher Fatima's younger sister, who still lived in a small village house surrounded by memories of the past. When she saw Rashid's photograph, she went pale. Through tears, she revealed that Meher had fallen in love with a foreign businessman many years ago. He had promised to marry her but disappeared before she gave birth to a daughter, Aarushi. The man's name, she said, was Rashid. When this information reached the investigators, everything began to make sense. Rashid had discovered on his wedding night that Aarushi was not just his young bride but his own granddaughter. The revelation must have destroyed him from the inside, filling him with horror and disgust. It explained the violence, the silence, and the emptiness that followed. The investigators now understood that the crime was not driven by jealousy or greed, but by the unbearable weight of a family secret too dark to exist. The court proceedings drew massive public attention. People filled the courtroom, eager to see the man who had lived in luxury but carried a curse within his bloodline. When Rashid finally spoke, his voice was calm and hollow. He confessed that the moment he saw Meher's name on the papers, he felt as though the world had ended. He said he could not live with the shame, nor allow his family name to be tied to such a sin. He described his actions not as murder, but as punishment, a twisted attempt to erase the mistake he had unknowingly created. His confession sent chills through everyone present. The court sentenced Rashid to life imprisonment. The story might have ended there, but fate had one last twist. 3 weeks later, guards found him dead in his cell, hanging silently in the early hours of morning. On the small desk near him was a single piece of paper with 5 words written in uneven handwriting. *My sins found me back. Aarushi was buried in her hometown, her grave covered with marigolds and photographs of her smiling face. People visited her resting place for months, leaving flowers and whispering prayers. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that secrets buried in the past never stay hidden forever. They wait patiently, buried in silence, until the day they return demanding justice, no matter the cost.